Hello everyone, today we talk about Scythian warfare. So this is a huge topic like the ones that I unfortunately decide to pick every time. I don't know how long this video will get, but I think it's an important chapter of ancient history and warfare. I'm not an expert on the Scythians myself. I already made actually a video about the Scythians and the Sarmatians back in the day. I'm sure it's somewhere in my migration era playlist, and you can check it out. There was a general introduction about these populations, maybe can clarify and introduce this video a little bit. This one is, in fact, as I said, strictly to say Scythian military history, what we can definitely grasp from it, also because we don't have an excessive amount of information on military history proper. I mean, we have lots of archaeological evidence, etc., but the historians of the ancient world, obviously the Scythians didn't have their own historians, at least ones that could made written records or that have survived, so it's just as usual, the Greeks and the Romans that spoke about these populations. However, they had an enormous importance and were praised in the ancient world essentially as they had this fame of invincibility in part, and they were indeed very warlike people that we are looking at essentially between the 8th and the 2nd century BC. After that, the Scythians began to decline as for many reasons that we'll try to scope later. Essentially it was the Sarmatians who kind of took over them, and they were actually pretty analogous, pretty homogeneous to the Scythians, at least in their origin. They say that the Scythians progressively sedentarized in part. They had a less warlike character. They kind of begin to settle down. The Sarmatians were more freshly from the steppes. They had a higher military average. They kind of overwhelmed these populations, which however blended essentially together. So surely much of what happened also in the migration era meant periodic, in the periodical sense in the later times, was also done in part by the descendants of the Scythians, and surely there was a military tradition that remained in the steppe overall too, and the Scythians deserved their own place in military history for this reason. So we're essentially talking about the early Iron Age in here. The Scythians inhabited this region, let's say, of the so-called Pontic steppes. The Pontus Euxinus was in fact the Black Sea, and these are the regions of the steppes that roughly extend in today's Ukraine and up to the Caucasus. So this is actually the cradle of origin of the seemingly of the Indo-European peoples. Today's also Russia, Kazakhstan. Eventually, these populations, actually the Scythians, as such, are sometimes we have ethnographical problems of definitions. These peoples as well were also known as the Saka, generally speaking, as a group of essentially would be the Iranian branch of the Indo-European populations. In fact, they stretched pretty far, essentially from the Carpathians to very far, pretty far up to China, telling the truth, and they even intruded into India, and some of the greatest also demands, for instance, that gave origin to the same Achaemenid Empire were in origin Scythian in practice, as they dwelled so were the Parthians largely so it's difficult even to distinguish according to tradition. Because it's difficult to distinguish because sometimes we name the Scythians mostly, the population, from a Western perspective, geographically speaking, these populations that dwelled into essentially today's Ukraine. But of course, these populations that stretch from, all over the Eurasian steppes were actually broadly known with this name, and then definitely were tribal repartitions about which we don't also know much. the same classical authors had this pretty sketchy idea of what was happening there, because they surely went there as merchants and as explorers, etc., but they never kind of had let's say a full grasp of what was happening there. Also because they were pretty these were nomadic people. It was difficult to cope with them, generally speaking. However, the Scythians in this sense are important because they also interacted heavily with Europe, with the Near East, with the Middle East. As we were saying, they reached up to India and then to China. So they had actually a huge importance, which is often underestimated. And in fact, this also narrow temporal and geographical dimension we kind of try to draw about, at least for today's video, is actually in fact an approximation. It should be enlarged, and I think much more credit should be given to the world of the steppe, historically speaking, because it's objectively this place from which that regurgitated continuously these populations and eventually came to that were essentially the Indo-Europeans. So from, say, to Portugal to China, you have this huge world that also influenced heavily the Near East and the Middle East, etc. That in origin came all from the same stock, all from the same culture over the millennia before Christ. And in fact, let's say that the Indo-European migrations in this sense are also distinguishable with difficulty sometimes, because these populations had not already differentiated. Even when you hear things like Proto-Celtic, Proto-German, I mean, these, how it's important. I think it's more important to stress the previous common origin, rather than these early differentiations that eventually took a broader shape and form only when these Indo-European Aryan populations settled down into Europe in this case, but also as we've seen elsewhere. So they I don't know where to start, honestly, because we have also pretty scanty evidence. Herodotus writes, for instance, the Scythians had essentially invaded the lands of the Cimmerians, the Cimmerian tribes that inhabited and dwelled in there. We don't know what the Cimmerians practically were. We assume they were they were ethnically Indo-European as well, but also in here we have no clear evidence, at least. However, they were probably still very akin to these the population in there, and they definitely had a huge impact. I mean, the Scythians from these Ukrainian plains sent many offensives all around and crushed peoples like, for instance, the same Medes that eventually were to found the Achaemenid dynasty and so on. Early in the 7th century, the Scythians also moved against Assyria, that we discussed. They began to discuss recently as a military power in Schwerpunkt. And it's unfortunate that seemingly they achieved very important results against the Syrian Empire. At the time was definitely the greatest power in the area. And unfortunately, the Syrians were a bit cocky, and they didn't want to admit defeats and all. So there is a bit of silence of this. But from other informations, we generally, however, we know that the Scythians managed to ravage the Near East, the Middle East, and it is very interesting because these, by the way, were at the time very, for those time standards, very intensely urbanized areas, and usually these, the peoples of the steppes, also later with the Parthians, etc., were usually deemed to be pretty incapable in siege warfare, and instead it seems that they managed to be quite successful, even in this situation, and they evidently also adapted in part in ways that we unfortunately do not know. But definitely these were essentially raiding parties. It's also difficult to say, these were probably individual tribes, or maybe surely tribes also joining together, but it's difficult to tell really within the same Scythian system. But surely there were tribes that were more leaning towards different political directions and objectives. And at a certain point, the Assyrians managed to make peace with them. Also because the Assyrian Empire was a kind of a tough nut to crack, evidently also for the Scythians. They probably the ancient historians tells us a lot of anecdotes of how these things really happen, and there's a lot of metaphorical use of metaphors in here. Eventually the Assyrians probably began to pay tributes to these populations to keep them at bay, as it was normal to do at the time, definitely. And it was similarly also a royal marriage between the king, I think the king of the Assyrians, and the daughter of it was the Assyrian king Esarhaddon and the daughter of the Scythian king Partatua. So at this point, the Scythians also kind of switched objectives, and they started hitting hard in Palestine and Egypt. Even the Bible tells us essentially about these populations that were considered to be they were not considered fully as barbarians as eventually they were kind of stereotyped in especially from the Greeks and the Romans. In the Near East, in the Middle East, there was a kind of also of, and definitely also among the Greeks and the Romans. I mean, it was stressed, especially also the ancient, the age of these people. It was seemingly quite ancient, and that they spoke a very different language from the one it was spoken in the Near East. That eventually were Semitic languages mostly. So the Scythians spoke Indo-European. So also here. There were two very different cultures, and they also in here there's this typical Aryan ideal that was recognized by all the other populations, that the Scythians were so courageous and that were deadly. They were always associated to their bows and arrows and quivers that dispensed death against their enemies, and were essentially pictured also as locusts, as ravagers, essentially, as pillagers that took all the harvest and bread, and they were also considered as cannibals, anthropophagists. I don't know how to say this in English. Anthropophagus, yeah. Because indeed we will see it later, the Scythians were pretty, they performed pretty bloody human sacrifices, and there were also this idea of eating your own enemy. There is all a oral literature about this, and we'll probably discuss this when dealing a bit more in depth with the Tierkampf, and this idea of eating your own enemy, whether it's a man or an animal, that essentially gives gives strength to you, his strength to you, by eating his flesh or wearing his skin. This was actually present in many Indo-European civilizations, and not all just in Indo-European peoples, and not just in those. Excuse me, I drink a little. So, even the Egyptians had great trouble with them during the 7th century. The Pharaoh Psammetichus I prevented massive, large-scale Scythian invasion by essentially paying, also in here, a very heavy tribute to them. This was very important because indeed the tribute could also save a lot of energies from the same Scythians, because you might be interested in ravaging a very fertile land, but if the guys pay you a fair amount, you can be fine with that. You don't risk your life. And definitely a lot of the international relations in the ancient or medieval, but even in our own world, to be honest, were based on this form of tributes of paying to keep at bay, or to back, and depending also on the political affiliations and so on. So after that, the Scythians definitely came back even into Assyria, pillaging in there, especially in the second half of the 7th century BC, and even Media fell. This Media was a very important, very powerful area in there, and the Medes had been, as we've seen originally, also in the Europeans, were very influenced by the Scythians, and it was indeed a Scytho-Median army that in 612 BC captured Nineveh and overthrew the Assyrian Empire. So even the Achaemenids are born essentially from this thing of the steppe, and this is something I like to stress very much. I mean, the idea that the Achaemenids were not this, sometimes we picture, especially during the Persian wars, this idea of, the Europeans from one side and the Asian hordes from another, very stereotypically, and how we have been liking to picture, especially from the Enlightenment, if anything. Telling you the truth, if there were true Aryans during the Persian wars, this probably existed into the Persian army, as also because of the Persians leaving lots of populations dwelling into the Eurasian steppes and taking them essentially from the springs, and including Scythians indeed, but even the same Achaemenids descended in practice from that. Then obviously I'm not making it as a puristic ethnical point. I mean, it's obvious that these populations eventually blended in with the Semitic populations, and but it's still important to realize how influential these nomads of the steppes actually were, because we actually all descend from them, especially as Caucasians. So it's extremely important. And Indo-European languages, so the languages are spoken worldwide, even so far and so wide. So it's you really have to think it even from a non-narrow Western perspective, and to realize that this common stock actually is common to us by many other peoples in the world. So also here, the Scythians had this moment of acme, when it basically ravaged the whole Asian continent. Well, probably not the whole one, but definitely far and wide. And surely, just thinking that our evidence is pretty scanty, and sometimes we don't understand in the sources. Think about the Chinese Empire, how difficult it is sometimes to even understand who were these populations who dwelled west of China, and that with which the Chinese empires interacted. So there was probably a much greater movement than we can imagine in there. That kept, by the way, these Eurasian peoples and these steppes peoples extremely also good in military quality, because it's the environment of the steppes that kind of obliges you to have a kind of predatory economy to survive, and you can argue that there was, surely there were moments of peace and all, but warfare was practically endemic, and these tribal contingent formations were extremely unstable, extremely always turning one against the other, and there were extremely complex dynamics involved. And surely what we should also think about is probably they were at a much longer range than we can imagine. I mean, we get, historically speaking, only the perspective of the sedentary world at this point, whichever it was, whether it was Europe, whether it was the Middle East. So populations that were sedentarized, so populations like the Europeans that at a certain point were essentially the same descendants of these steppes peoples, and that regarded them, however, as now something different, something barbaric. But probably it would be extremely fascinating to look at their own historical perspective, to probably figure out that they had an extreme knowledge, also at a very far range, geographically speaking, to know where to, because they needed to know essentially where to hit these sedentary populations. So it would have been so strange to see certain populations making back and forth from from Siberia to the Pannonian Plains, just for the sake of finding, I don't know, new fresh pastures. Especially that was main concern. Then also areas to pillage and to hit. And so there was also in here a very conflictual relation that went on constantly between the nomads and the sedentaries. The Achaemenids also had to keep these guys under control in some way, and they, as we'll see later, they also engaged into large-scale warfare with them, arriving even to invade Scythia herself. But let's say that from at least the end of the 7th century, the Scythians were kind of now settling down in some way and remaining confined to these areas that we were saying before, the Ukraine, etc. And much remains still unclear about how many other groups kind of moved around, and naturally you have to think there was a very high degree of autonomy relatively to these invasions. I mean, there wasn't a central authority. There were definitely certain hierarchies. There were the royal Scythians, so these tribes that kind of had managed to impose their preeminence over other Scythians and non-Scythians alike in the Ukrainian plain. But there were still a big deal of smaller bands that would essentially go around the world being hired also as mercenaries and selling their service, or just going to pillage or to find new lands to settle somewhere. So what else can we add now? There was a general consensus about however, the military quality and the courage of Scythians, and this is proven by the fact that they kept in check some of the most advanced empires at the time, as we saw before. So what were the Scythians warriors really about? Well, there would be a lot of details actually, because we have lots of archaeological evidence, fortunately enough for us, Scythian burials. I think there are even up to 1,000 barrow mounds known as kurgans from this locality that eventually was also battlefield during World War II. And this basically, the Scythians had these mounds that were essentially burial mounds, where warriors were essentially buried together with lots of goods. That is fortunately also makes up our largest evidence about their weaponry and armor. And there are extremely rich finds of this. Obviously there was also in here is kind of social segmentation relatively to, I don't know, from the kings to the average freeman, and we see a freaking lot of different, essentially an arsenal of armor, helmets, swords, quivers, of arrows, spears, and so on. So we have a pretty accurate depiction of what these populations kind of looked like. In terms of equipment, maybe it will be more detailed next time. Essentially, the Scythians, we can make a general consideration just to approximate it, because if we focus on the singular finds, it's gonna take forever, and maybe we'll skip this. Essentially, there was a kind of homogeneity. First of all, we have to think in the equipment of the steppes peoples. Surely the Scythians were closer to to certain sedentary populations, especially they entered in contact now with the Hellenic civilization that was spreading in the whole Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. So actually there were many Scytho-Hellenic, even in Greek theater, you see there is a lot. The figure of the Scythians recur pretty much in Hellenic culture, and surely the same Greeks had a big deal of warfare with these populations, but they also used to hire them as mercenaries. So this probably brought the Scythians to have probably a greater access to certain resources, especially some, and they were probably wealthier than some other peoples of the steppes. So sometimes in the finds the archaeological finds, we see these magnificent, especially wait a second, extremely well decorated and magnificent gold working, especially goldsmithing, jewelry, and a big deal of extremely and very richly decorated weapons and so on. So naturally, like in all times, there was a distinction between certain ceremonial equipment and some of the one that could be actually used into battle. This happens all the time, but definitely with the Scythians we have to imagine them sometimes covered from foot, from head to toe, let's say, of this extremely rich armor of various materials, either iron or bronze, that were definitely belonging to the elite. Well, I personally don't think the Scythians had such a widespread amount of armor. I think they were pretty much probably had a higher degree than other peoples, but at the same time the average Scythian horsemen, because these were naturally, I didn't explicitate it now, but it pretty obviously these were horse riding peoples, they were nomadic peoples, always fighting on horseback. They were lightly equipped, sometimes even without any form of armor, and that was functional actually to tactics, because among the steppes peoples, the armored contingents were a very narrow elite, both numerically speaking and also from a political and social point of view. Normally, the heaviest troops belonged to the, let's say, the royal tribes, the ones that were at the top, and while the bulk of the army in numerical strength was provided by all these tributary populations that provided essentially lots of horse archers that were essentially to prepare to pave the road eventually to the charges of the heavy cavalry that, albeit short in number, were definitely pretty much devastating. And there's a bit of a stereotype about the Scythians thinking, I mean, they didn't have such a heavy shock cavalry, especially when compared with the Sarmatians, certain tribes like the Alani and so on. But this is actually false, and the Scythians surely were extremely capable of performing very devastating charges, also with with the contest that is mostly said, okay, this associated to the Sarmatians or other heavier cavalries, but definitely the Scythians were perfectly capable of doing that. What it seems, though, is so they were perfectly analog, say, virtually identical to any nomadic people at the time. By the way, there was an evolution of civilization also in the steppe. So I'm not saying that the warriors of the steppes were the same, say, in 700 BC and in 100 BC. There were changes also in there as civilization kind of progresses. But I think that the greater change in the Scythian warfare, also in terms of equipment, etc., came when the Scythians began to slowly to settle down. The Ukrainian plains are rather fertile. They're well connected to the Mediterranean traffics. There was definitely a lot of material culture being exported from the Mediterranean into the Scythian lands. This, by the way, the Scythians were essentially importing weaponry. Sometimes you find also on Scythian jewelry and decorations Scythian cavalrymen, so typical warriors of the steppes wearing actually Greek armor, like Greek stylized armor, which doesn't mean they fought like the Greeks at all. And this is, I mean, with the Scythians it's kind of more evident, but people kind of try to trace certain parallelisms also with other populations. Nobody actually fought fights in a way just because he uses the same weapons. It doesn't work like that. But just for saying that as it was happening for other populations that we can see later. For instance, the Gauls. You know, there is this moment of originally extremely fierce tribal military culture that progressively gets softened up by the riches, by settling down, and kind of partly abandoning the lifestyle of the steppes. Also considering that the Scythians at this point were closer with the kind of at the western edge of the Eurasian steppes, so they weren't in the middle of nowhere, but surrounded by other horse riding peoples. They also were pretty much in touch with the Getae, with the Thracians, that were also probably had a very good cavalry also on their own, but they were definitely more sedentary populations. And by osmosis, probably these Balkanic populations got a bit more mounted in fighting. We see that especially with the Thracians, that north of the Danube they were much more they made a much greater use of cavalry than the ones they did on the right bank of the Danube in the south. But at the same time, this brought from the other side to the citizens to sedentarize a little more, and also changing their warfare accordingly. For instance, the Scythians are the Scythian burials shows us a lot of javelins used, and these were used actually the whole steppe, but they're in the full steppe mode. Let's say what you mostly rely on is archery. Also, the great range. The Scythian bow was something amazing. It was claimed to have shot up to 500 meters, which sounds obviously as a pretty like a record. But the Scythians had these composite bows reinforced with plates of bone, and it meant this elasticity. That the Scythian bow, this composite bow, the steppe was done like a sigma in shape. For this, it was basically how do you say that? When it was relieved, it was flexed backwards, so that when it had to be stretched, pulled, basically you had to do it, even changing its form in the other sense. So this conferred. It was much more. The composite bows were much stronger than the other ones were used in Western Europe. So that they were feared, and we have lots of evidence of from the burials of wounds that were of bones that on spines and skulls were deeply penetrated by the Scythian arrows, for not talking about the armor. We find also many what appears to be certain Greek armor of the area of Crimea, of today's Crimea. There was plenty of Greek colonies on the coast with this, all full of holes, essentially perforated by these what seem to be evidently arrows. So the Scythians actually always use this. But when you see that there are also lots of javelins involved, well, that tells you quite reasonably that that implies also another kind of type of fighting that is more of a close range, which suggests probably that certain Scythians had begun to grow closer to the local warfare that was based also on this. I mean, having javelins the javelin was practically the primary weapon of the ancient world. Javelin / spear, because actually it's practically impossible most of the times to determine whether one, whether such weapons were were javelins or spears. Sometimes they were both. Some were more differentiated in this sense, and surely the Scythians had very long lances for charging and so on, but also some of them were literally thrown, and you have to think that with weapons on the battlefield you can do literally everything, and this happened at all times. So there is this, however, evidence that the Scythians grew a bit more closer to the warfare of the local populations, and therefore losing their even mounted warfare, because we have evidence from Diodorus Siculus that we'll quote later for essentially the only battle into which Scythian forces are kind of trackable in their tactics, tells us that sometimes the Scythians could field twice as infantry as than cavalry. And this naturally is explainable through not just the sedentarization of the Scythians, but also with the levying of local populations who were otherwise previously sedentary, but also, in fact, the same Scythians who had progressively also grown more sedentarized, or also just poorer. They couldn't afford a horse, and they were fielded together with the rest of the cavalry. So also here metallurgy was quite advanced. I won't get into details because first of all I don't know excessively much about it, but also because it might be kind of misleading. At least we have a lot to say. As we were saying, there were so many. The typical equipment of the Scythians in terms of clothing was this kind of Phrygian cap. In these robes, like kaftans, or better, they had trousers and other. These were quite pragmatic, I'd say, quite comfortable clothes that were evidently formed during millennia of tough environmental conditions in the steppes, both for essentially temperature problems, as clothes mostly are, but also for, in terms of conferring agility and also in combat and so on. And as I was saying before, most of the Scythians were actually equipped in that way. So the average Scythian horse archer was basically this: his horse, his robe with his cap and trousers and shirt, then quiver with arrows, composite bow, several javelins a la lazo, and these were naturally all extremely skilled breeders. Essentially, the horse breeding was like the most important thing in here. By the way, the horses had a special importance, in fact, in not just in Scythian warfare, but in Scythian society and religion, even as a whole. As the horse, also in here, we discussed this often. Schwerpunkt was the same symbol of the sky and of the earth. It was the mean through which the knight, we can say, more than the cavalryman, could rise to the heavens. And in fact, this is the reason why there are so many horses buried together with their masters in this Scythian mounds, together also with the slaughtered prisoners, by the way. Probably because they were meant to, I don't know, to be servants in the afterlife. But there was this continuous relation in the steppe that was felt also very much given the landscape. All you see is this land, endless land. It obviously can be very varied because there are so many different landscape. I don't know, from the Ukraine to Turkmenistan to China to Russia. I mean, but the idea is the flat land and the sky, the flat land and the sky. In fact, all these steppes populations kind of had, also like the Mongols, they had this essentially celestial deity. There was a bit the symbol of the same sky, and that from which life, and the horse was a symbol of both, because the horse is typically a very sanguine animal, but it comes from the herd, from this cycle of nature, decomposition of this blood and dirt that reassumes this magnificent form of the horse. So a very chthonic figure that is present in all Indo-European mythologies, also with this function, but it is at the same time able to bring the knight to the glory of the sky, to the military glory that comes from the above. And in fact, what you see also in this Scythian archaeological finds is a freaking lot of symbols of eagles that are disturbingly, I mean, disturbingly, extremely fascinatingly close to the same symbols you find scattered all over the migration era among these Aryan populations. You find them among the Germans, among even the same Roman eagle. I dedicated probably what I deem to be my best video to this whole story. I mean, even the Romans came, the Italics came from this same Indo-European stock. The concept of the winged glory that comes from the sky, something you find also with the Nika in Greece, and something you find, I don't know, recently I made a video about Celtic totemic animals, and you see these Celtic winged helmets you can also find in Asterix, for instance, if you prefer to make a banal example. But that were scattered all over the Indo-European cultures, because in a more or less, say, aware way, these populations had all in common this ancient idea of the military glory coming from this sky, and being especially a horseman prerogative. This is something you see also in the decursio rite, the funerary rite of the Roman emperors, where there were knights running around and throwing their own military rewards and decorations into the fire of the funerary say, how do you say that in English, the pyre, yeah, that was burnt. So the idea was that this decorations, this military glory, was returned to the skies by raising up through the smoke into the sky. So it was a very deep meaning that is really the core, the essential core of Aryan identity. It's all based on that in all Indo-European civilizations. Even the Persians have the symbol of the eagle. So it was all together, and the Scythians had it too, naturally. So there were a lot of also other piece of armor for the heavier cavalrymen, like greaves, cuirasses, there's helmets of cast bronze. You know that bronze, if properly worked, is much more effective than iron. In this time in history, telling you the truth, in fact, it never fell out of date, and the Scythians have sometimes this extremely beautiful bronze armor. And this belonged definitely to the elite, and to the heavy cavalry that also probably was partially armored, although I think for the Scythians we don't have any direct evidence of fully armored cavalry, but that is something that, however, by certain extent existed, especially, but it was the ultra elite, like in all the other populations who fielded such cataphracts. There's plenty of these finds all over. Where for instance, at St. Petersburg, at the Hermitage, there are some beautiful example of armor. Fortunately, we have a freaking deal of evidence. I think since Soviet times, the Russians, Russian archaeologists made an extensive work to find out this evidence, and was fortunately plenty of them, in absence, unfortunately, of further, let's say, strictly historiographical evidence from the ancient world. There was a big deal also in the shield, put in the shield decorations, and from here we can also observe some kind of totemic evidence, or sometimes also in here there is Greek evidence. Especially in the Scytho-Hellenic land, you find the many Hellenic mythological figures that were kind of motivated from the Scythians. The Scythians also fought against the Macedonians, to be defeated, by the way. So it's very, very interesting, and it witnesses also the degree of hybrid, let's say, the hybrid nature of those lands in terms of military culture. So here there are other examples. So I don't know what to add to this. We have lots of helmets also in evidence. Some of them had this. Some of them were very enclosing, just like a bit the the ancient Corinthian type of helmet. They had this skull cap, especially, that was very anatomic, but otherwise they were, as we were saying, also Phrygian styled helmet. Some of these kind of helmets you find in any, for instance, Hellenistic cavalry. It was definitely, and definitely you can imagine, for especially for the elite, the Scythian elite, that this armor was sometimes a status symbol, and even importing. Usually, the Scythian smiths could simply import iron or bronze and to work them on their own, or finding it somewhere else, from, say, not just the Mediterranean. But sometimes they just bought the artifacts were already produced, and the Greek world at that time was seen also as kind of the most advanced. So it was a pride for a Scythian chieftain to wear such armor, because this happened pretty much everywhere, telling the truth. Everybody will, at the time, in these European populations that Central European populations came into contact with the Greeks, they kind of adopted their panoply in style as a fashionable thing. It happened in among the Etruscans, it happened among the Illyrians, and in Carthage as well, so not just in Europe. But it was normal, and the interesting thing about it is that probably the Scythian warlike culture also kind of worked as a spin-off for the Hellenic production and market to function, to produce and to export these artifacts. So it's important, and we surely think that also the Greeks and other populations were influenced by the Scythian armor. There was sometimes also this made of plaques or lamellae, etc. And these were, in fact, in the broad material culture of the ancient world, pretty much shared technologies that could really be worn. And the Scythians put a lot of a great importance into their corselets. Seemingly didn't have male armor. At least we have no evidence of male armor making up an entire Scythian armor, although certain pieces were probably being used. We'd rather have these lamellar corselets. They were very important because they're generally more effective against arrows, and especially for horsemen that's very important, because while you're on horseback you're kind of very exposed and very heavy target. So also a big deal, the reason why cavalry like cataphracts developed in the steppes was not just having a shock elite cavalry, was also a matter of protecting the cavalrymen from the arrows that really rained and showered the armies continuously. You have to think their Scythian, say, broad Eurasian steppes warfare like a continuous exchange of a very thick fire of arrows, essentially, and therefore that's why probably also these the metallurgy in these areas that were otherwise more primitive were sometimes even more advanced than one of the sedentary world, because it was also triggered and developed by this same need of protecting by these omnipresent arrows that flew constantly at every time of battle, and that were also pretty sneaky, because many ancient orders tell us that these arrows were poisoned. That was also a very clever thing to do. Usually, well, no, I won't explain you how they were poisoned, but say it was seemingly common practice among the Scythians, who also had, like other steppes peoples, a kind of a psychological effect developed around this. For instance, Scythian arrows are recorded to whistle while firing, and this constant sound was also something extremely annoying, extremely stressing, because you begin to associate that in battle, especially if you're tempested for hours by enemy fire. to arrows arriving, and this kind of never ends, because if you have constantly hundreds of thousands of arrows in the air, especially in the largest encounters, you're gonna be like deafened by this sound, and it's terrible. And it was really meant to frighten the enemy. This is something you find in many other steppes peoples, including the Mongols later in time. They really knew their business, and they tried to maximize these effects, because, by the way, the arrows in this sense were rarely enough, despite how deadly they could be in terms of penetration or being poisoned, as we've seen. But they weren't never enough to wipe out the enemy out of the battlefield. The main objective of this arrows shower was literally to demoralize the enemy. No army in the ancient medieval world was ever able to knock out the enemy just by showering them with arrows. That was kind of a preparatory phase, after which necessarily heavy cavalry had to kick in to kind of trying to rout the now shattered enemy. But the Scythians in this, because by the way, arrows are also pretty costly. It's not something you can throw away, not even in the steppes, where resources are generally pretty meager. So even in there was a compromise, let's say a functional compromise between the time, say the concentration of fire, because you can, and normally we'll see it now. I think, by the way, I said. I think before I said something wrong. There are not 1,000 graves of Scythian graves known. There are up to 5,000, and practically all of them contain arrows. So this was extremely widespread. But the point I was trying to make, this is just a record, because before I said I made a mistake. It's important to note it gives you the sheer amount, 5,000 graves. I mean, you can really study a huge lot about these populations through their graves. Sometimes it's preferable on the battlefield to throw all what you have immediately, and then to immediately attack. Because one thing is having, 10,000 arrows and shooting them in some minute, and one thing is shooting them in some hours. In order to shatter the enemy at the point of making it waver and eventually charging in it, hoping that it will break, it's much more useful to throw all the arrows at once, or at least in a very short time, and to concentrate the effect. And that's going to be really deadly, and this is the tactics that any kind of Scythian army would follow. Obviously, this is a bit mechanicistic, because not always you can be in the conditions of performing that. Not necessarily. Every single battle is different, the terrain is different, there are so many events. Think about humidity, that also is not excessively good. These guys knew how to keep their bows dry, but that could be a problem. Even the soil inclination, obviously an arrow has a much greater force if you shoot it from an elevated position. And since the Scythians, especially within themselves and other similar peoples, were kind of used to do essentially the same exact thing, it was very often these external factors that, maybe aside from number difference in numbers in the armies, that could really make the difference. And also this was based on maneuverability, and we will see it especially later how important this would be. Ammianus Marcellinus, back in the late antique, wrote that while the bows of all peoples are made of flexible branches, the Scythian bows resemble the crescent moon, with both ends curved inwards. So this is what we were saying before, the sigma, the Greek letter sigma shape of the Scythian bow. And definitely we have evidence of this. I mean, not just from the bows, but also from other depictions that the Scythians really have in this. This bow was, by the way, not very large. It seemingly arrived up to 80 centimeters, But it's really the material that made, and this, by the way, made it also more, handy in many ways. It was really about the elasticity and the resistance that made it what it really was. And so this was based on a sort of compression rather than by the length of the stave of the bow. So what can we say about how the arrows were made? Maybe it was not so. The heads of the arrows were usually also in iron or bronze, or sometimes in bone, because bone is also in here an example of how materials were precious in the steppes, and everything was kind of fitted in. It was fair enough. In fact, there is beautiful evidence, especially from Siberia and other populations, of kind of entirely bone-made scale armor. And these were used actually, I think, up to the beginning of the 20th century by certain populations living in Russia in the far north and east. So just for saying that these were traditions that where everything was sedimented from millennia. In terms of know-how, also material culture, etc., was all pretty homogeneous in many ways, and every material was used, was not wasted, was really put to use effectively. So what else? What else? Relatively to the Scythian bow and properties, there was also this legend lost in the mists of mythology that was explained by Herodotus. Herodotus wrote a freaking lot about the Scythians that is useful. Also in a bit, obviously, in a kind of a metaphorical way. Herodotus is, sometimes I love Herodotus personally, but obviously not everything he wrote was true, but nevertheless that's not important. That's more important why he wrote and what he wrote, to understand what also sometimes the hidden meaning of this. And according to the legend, or to the myth if you prefer, Heracles left his famous bow to his sons when he set out from Scythia, saying essentially that only the son who could string the bow could become eventually ruler of the Pontic steppes. So first of all, this is very interesting because it shows that also in the Hellenic mythology there is the idea of the bow as a primary weapon. That is something you don't find in the West. Like Western culture eventually developed, especially the cult of the sword, that also the Scythians had. But let's say the idea of the bow as a primary weapon usually pertains more to the Eastern world, geographically meant. So also partly to these Indo-European peoples that lived in the steppe. But as we were saying, there is this great watershed between West and East, in the sense that in the West, in Europe, we made bows only in one way since prehistory, and then were not composite, were made, and it could vary in size, but the construction was the same. In the Eastern world, and there was the composite bow that, as we have seen, was much more effective. And so a lot of eddas, a lot of symbolism was also attached to that. And it's probably that Heracles that is a figure that has many equivalents in the other Indo-European religions. In this sense, with the legend of his bow, really was kind of a reminiscence of this past of the steppes where the bow was so important. And according to the same legend, Cetus, who was the youngest son of Hercules, so Cetus here, obviously you understand it's an ethnonym in this case, was succeeded in stringing the bow, and Herodotus states that the Scythians descended arguably from him, so from Cetus, son of Hercules, and of Hercules himself. So this is naturally a myth, a legend, but nevertheless it's very important because because same Greeks were obviously, I mean, Hercules is a prominent heroic figure in the Hellenic mythology, and this tells us essentially that there was an Hercules in common between the let's put it in this way, between the Greeks and the Scythians. So this, back in the midst of history, in the legions, this perception that even the Hellenes had come from the steppe back in the day was evidently alive, and definitely the same deity of war of the deities of war of the Scythians were have definitely many analogous symbolisms attached. I mean that there is in common between them and the other Indo-European figures. What else? Recently I talked a bit about totemism in the Celtic world. Naturally also in the Scythian world there were certain animals, prominently the horses, the deer, also the eagle, as we have seen. There were the I don't know how you say it. You call her in English. It was prominent all over the ancient world, especially from the Greek world, but the Gorgon, of the face of the Gorgon that allegedly transformed, petrified, let's say, men with just the sight. There was a prominent figure that was used on painted on the shields and all, because it had this say apotropag meaning to defend the enemy just from the enemy from the side, and turning him into stone. There is probably some might be other interesting things to say now, but whatever. Now this is maybe we can skip this. So very important in Scythian warfare, and this is also another important point to make because it's often understood. It's the importance of swords and daggers. Now there's this tendency that I don't know why that looks at the eastern populations. I'm not talking specifically about the Scythians, but especially the Persians that we have seen, and were also they had pretty much in common with these populations, to be kind of in this stereotypic fashion of the Easterners using prevalently sabers on horseback. But telling the truth, also in here there was a general I don't know how to say that a lineage kind of offspring of weapons and armor from the culture of the steppes. Essentially the Scythians had, just like the Persian, and straight swords, very straight and long swords that were used very importantly for especially for mounted combat, because they had the barycenter shifted towards the tip. Some of them look even like sort of stalks, so maybe that was also meant to pierce and not just to slash. Definitely, as most of swords anyway, but we don't have to be too sharply differentiating that. And also daggers were important, arguably because, especially the elites, they also used maces and all, because the elites would kind of take pride from clashing one against another. So in this mounted combat between armored warriors, it's easy. It's difficult to pierce the armor, and daggers and maces are sometimes preferred to cause either with daggers really usually hitting in more precisely the unarmored parts of the body, or with the maces to really smash under the armor, causing a blunt blunt effect. According to also in Hierolys to Herodotus, if I'm not wrong, it was said that the major deity of the Scythians was Ares, the god of war. This is probably false. I mean, surely the also the Scythians had different deities. Also in here, a very few is known. I might do a similar video, the one I did on the Celts, relatively to this topic. But let's say that it was still very important that the Greeks, in this case, looked at the Scythians, essentially observing there was a major deity, and it was the one of Ares. Now, Ares, you know that obviously this was not the Greek Ares, this was another deity that the Greeks now were interpreting as Ares. But also in here there might surely be something common in the European root. And what is important about Ares is not the only, at least in the Hellenic religion, it's not the only deity of war. Ares is probably the warrior. Also Athena is the goddess of war. But she's about the rational war, the citizen and war, the rational war. Ares is really the wild beast. You know, it's the beast-like warrior that does not own discipline, because in the Greek mythology, Athena and Ares fight sometimes, and Athena always wins over Ares because it's meant to embody, you know, discipline winning over barbarity and ferocity and pure furor, we could say, to use a Latin expression. This doesn't have to be underestimated, not even the word furor, because actually we know that the Scythians, similarly to other populations like the Germans, etc., but also this was the whole Indo-European world was permeated with this concept. They thought that essentially in war such deity could basically possess the warrior and to make him fall into a sort of state of trance and to deliver this fury on the battlefield that in this sense was also to mean the individual prowess, but through the channel, let's say, that was channeled into the individual from the deity. So when the Romans fighting with the Germans were talking about the Furor Teutonicus and saying, okay, these are kind of, sometimes, you know, if you interpret it from a rational way, it sounds like yeah, these guys were crazies, and like, I think also the berserkers and all, but telling the truth, it wasn't like that. It was something, by the way, also the Romans had, because the Romans had an extremely higher warlike edus, and they kind of worked a lot for a very long time in order to impose disciplines on these Italic warriors that were otherwise pretty similar to the ones of the Central Europe. This furor was actually this trance. In the case of the Germans, it was infused essentially by Woden or Odin, and it had a very deep religious meaning, because even the Germans had figures in their religion looked a bit more like Hercules, but that mostly stressed the prowess of the let's say of the individual, strictly physical man, because also Hercules is not a god, he's a hero, he's a demi-god, and it's meant to be like, I don't know, Gilgamesh in previous in other cultures, etc. This the peak of human possibilities, essentially, that however cannot be surpassed. Like eventually Hercules gets killed with a betrayal, which is also typical of Germanic. Think about Siegfried or something like that. I mean, it's something you find all the time. So it's not strictly, you know, the god of war in this sense is not to be meant as the, you know, cocky guy who is cool and fights with giants and gets drunk or beats them and drinks and eats a lot. I mean, this kind of super macho figure. It's actually something much more spiritual, much less physical, and really much more spiritual. And this is what you can find with Odin in this sense as well. And for the Scythians, it's witnessed the same shamanic trance that was, let's say, performed in order to make these warriors, these brotherhoods of wandering warrior units to kind of get adopted by the deity and to receive this form of fury. This was scattered literally all over the Aryan world and even beyond. And this is what kind of it's always the same. I should open a larger digression in this. I mean, the value of instinct over discipline, because there are lots of people who believe that war is a matter of instincts, and they tend to attribute a derogatory nature to war as a kind of an irrational thing. Actually, war, as we know it, as an organized thing, it comes from Athena. It comes from reason. It comes from politics, actually. This other kind of war was something different, was the instinctive one, the animal-like one, that it was embodied by Ares instead. And it was, in this sense, detrimental, because Ares is hot-tempered, is impetuous, he is... in this sense, he loses against the reason of war. So this is what also the Greek and Roman world played a bit on. I mean, the idea that this sedentary, rich populations of the Mediterranean had formed this highly, efficient and disciplined and trained armies, and that could withstand with discipline and silence and all the fury of these barbarian populations. It was a lot of Eddas attached to that, but at the same time, still the military glory also of the Greeks and of the Romans came from paradoxically the same deity of war, especially this celestial deity that was meant to confer victory and glory. So that's why, during the Roman triumph, you had the guy next to the chariot of the triumphant general, who was, by the way, wearing the winged the crown, and was telling him, remember, you're just a man, because it was objectively believed that this glory derived from the gods and nothing else. In that case, from Jupiter, that in fact was the celestial deity par excellence of the Romans, that also, by the way, emerged from the mists of history pretty quickly. So the Romans retained actually a freaking deal of this kind of warlike Eddas for a long time, and arguably never got rid of it, because also, we can argue during the ancient world and even the Middle Ages, this kind of individual prowess of was always there, because it's so instinctive. This is the point I wanted to make before. It's not something you can get rid by simply saying, okay, well, let's all get rational. And no, because even the most trained professional war professional can essentially go wild during the battle and screwing everything up, because this is normal, because at the end of the day we're all human beings, and this is why discipline is so important, because it's much easier to stick to fury than to discipline, and at a certain point you always lose discipline under stress. So that's why discipline was used. It was used as an antidote against this otherwise extremely spread, extremely natural warlike feeling and hot temper that all humans have, more or less deep inside. So the Scythians, in this sense, revered their own war deities by building also here certain altars. There were certain mounds made of brushwood, usually. And what is interesting is that an old iron sword was placed at the top of each mound. this was typical of the Scythians, and this was the altar proper. So the altar to the deity of war, to the celestial deity of war, that was symbolized, in fact, by this sword. Because, by the way, also the sword had this time a very deep religious meaning. The sword was considered also the metal, and this is also associated to the, also to the horse. I mean, the metal and the horse come from the same earth. They're kind of magic in some way. They have this everything. There was nothing like a secular ancient world. Everything had a specific religious meaning, and the sword was conceived as a sort of alter ego of the warrior. And what is interesting is that not just the Scythians had this practice, also the Sarmatians, that came later, landed also with the Scythians. It was probably quite widespread all over the Iranian branch of the Indo-European peoples, and this is arguably what eventually originated partly also the tradition of Excalibur, the sword in the stone. And this is particularly interesting because this would happen in Britain simply because of the Sarmatian auxiliaries that were stationed in there by the Romans at the end of the late antique, and eventually remained to present this kind of knightly figure that the Sarmatians had this very strong cataphracts, and they had this sword. So the concept of the medieval knight was already there from that, and that probably exported this idea of the sacred sword, something of the mount, of the thing that the sword that was stuck in this rock, that had even a greater meaning and symbolism, and that conferred in this sense a divine power to the beholder of the sword. And it's interesting, in fact, that the Arthurian religions basically develop at that very age, essentially in Romano, in the Romano British context. So around these altars, the Scythians practiced their most horrifying human sacrifices. There was a libation, usually made up of wine. It was poured over the heads of prisoners of war that were carried there as a spoil of war, in this sense as the fruit of war, of something that had been in this sense gifted by the divinity to the warriors as a reward for their, for that symbolized their victory, essentially. So it was felt as something owed to the divinity. So these prisoners were brought in there. They would place wine on their heads, because literally there was a lot of at least anthropophagus meaning attached to this. These prisoners had to be eaten alive by the divinity. So they poured wine on it just to make it more tasty. So the victim throats were cut and their blood collected, and this blood was carried over the top of the mound and poured over the sword. At the foot of the altar, these prisoners were dismembered and their limbs thrown, literally scattered everywhere, and left where they were falling, essentially. And while the trunks laid separately, so an extremely bloody practice that tells you how violent was this world. Obviously, we have very different moral standards today, but we have to make an effort to not to justify them, to understand them, at least to know why this was done. And this is evidently the picture of an extremely brutal and violent world as such, because human sacrifice was something you find also elsewhere in other forms. You can argue that also the Greeks and the Romans didn't really make human sacrifices, but the idea of exposing, the enemy's heads or something like that, it did definitely have a sort of kind of religious meaning. We have actually many evidence of this. also in the Roman army. So in a moment in the early empire, so in the moment where technically the Romans were the mostly modern, and this has always remained. I mean, the idea you basically kill your enemy and you get his strength, and you thank the divinity for having made it possible. It's something very, very important because it all passed through the divinity. And the interesting, so a very brutal society that needed this to actually comfort the deity. It would be interesting to deepen this anthropologically speaking, but it was kind of felt like old. I mean, humans are not different from the times of the Scythians to today. We are the same people, so probably this sacrifice horrified in part even these same Scythians, in the sense that obviously cutting a person to pieces is not something very nice to do, something humans feel pleasure for. It's definitely something but perhaps obviously these guys were kind of used to a much higher degree of violence than we are. But at the same time, it was really felt as a duty to thank the deity, because it was really felt that the deity would otherwise take the favor out of you if you had not rewarded it properly. This was polytheism in a nutshell. It was a very contractualistic perspective. What is fascinating about this was told by Herodotus, and there is archaeological excavations which seemingly confirmed this. So they found scattered parts of human bodies around these mounds, especially the excavations near to Zaporizhia. I think it's in the Ukraine. So Zaporozhye, sorry, not Zaporizhia. So this was a quite widespread tradition. I mean, these mounds were something there are still existing mounds in Scythia. Some there even in Scythia, in the lands inhabited formerly by the Scythians, I remain to the ancient world. They're also huge, telling you the truth. Sometimes there were certain hills that were probably also used directly, not just mounds were not just built from scratch. So this was another kind of picturesque example about the Scythians. There's also the shape of swords and changing over time. Seemingly over the later times, towards the 5th century, Scythian swords kind of got bit more triangular in shape. Although I think other forms, like the one we described before, kind of remained in use. So this is not perhaps excessively important. It could tell something about also in here a more a use of these swords in a more sedentary environment, in the sense that if you have a very long, narrow sword, you use just an horseback. It has this. It's conceived mostly for that, and then you start fighting also on foot extensively, as we will see the Scythians began to do, as well. Probably a triangular shape is mostly meant also to cut, rather than just to thrust or to arrive like a sort of thing from the bow, and also probably a bit more. Also shorter. Also daggers seemingly appear more frequently, if I'm not wrong, in later times. So this suggests there was probably some differentiation also in the way of combat, naturally. But I won't go further than this because I know fairly nothing about it. Maybe I can deepen the topic in another occasion. Okay. The Scythians were famous, as we said before, also for javelins that are found in extensive quantity. We have very long ones that could definitely be used for horse charges, but Others were kind of shorter, like 1.7, 1.8 meters long. These were mostly thrown and for thrusting and and by the way, these populations were pretty much used also to hunt a lot. So these were, it's not really that difficult to hunt. It's not that different to hunt a man or a animal. So these weapons kind of, it sounds bad, but so it is. So these weapons turned useful into kind of the same way, in both in war and to hunt. A javelin has a range. These short javelins have a range of like 30 meters. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. And they have mostly a shock. The concept of javelin is that it's something that is meant also to pierce armor and to have a greater impact, also in terms of the mass on a shorter range. It's something you can explode on a shorter range, especially on horseback. There were cavalries in the ancient world, even if they didn't use bows. With a javelin they could really make a hell of a fire. Think about populations like the Numidians, and the Scythians seemingly did this too. So there is a bit this cliche that Scythian cavalry, especially towards the end, was growing, especially as a cavalry of light skirmishers rather than horse archers or chargers. But this is a bit stereotypical, but perhaps it's not extremely far tangentially from the truth. So also here the spearheads could vary. Some were long and short, others were barbed. They could be really as short as darts, like 30 centimeters, so very short, something you could throw just like a flying, seemingly, I don't know, I haven't seen these finds, but there were similar darts used also in other times of ancient history. Others could be as long as 70 centimeters. Sorry, we're talking about spearheads here, not about the darts, but there were also darts that were kind of shorter. And in this sense, the length could vary. But sorry, here the 30 centimeters to 27 to 72 was the spearhead. I make mistakes. When I make mistakes, I'm fair enough to say I got it wrong. So don't worry about that. I'm going always to do that. But also in here, the difference in shape of the spearheads is important, because different shapes also kind of tend to do different things. I think there is a general, the longer the blade is, tendentially, I think this spear is going to be used mostly for not to be thrown, but also for fencing in some way. Because it gives you more edge, it's usually longer, it's conceived in a way also probably, it's usually also larger as a blade, so it can make horrendous wounds through the skin or a human body. So yeah, also in here a varied range. And actually the Scythians, if you look at it in perspective, they kind of covered the entire range of weaponry that existed in the ancient world. It's not that there were many peoples who didn't, but at least the Scythians appear to have been quite versatile. At least there was a transformation in their society that made them adopting, especially certain times, certain type of weapons, and a variety of weapons really. So it was in fact the javelins intended solely for missile use. That is not a proper definition, because technically every javelin can be used also as a dagger in some way, but some were more conceived for being thrown, were in fact more similarly like darts, and these were more barbed, because that's the kind of adds to the chances that if that blade is gonna hit the enemy, it's doesn't matter what the angle is, you're just more likely to cause an horrendous wound, and to increase the chances of injuring the enemy consistently. And naturally, when these things got into the flesh, they were quite hard to pull out, and we have seen how some of them were also poisoned. You have to think that at this point it was not even, even a if the concept of the barbed head of a missile is the concept. You're gonna essentially expose the wound and the tissues to oxygen that makes bacteria entering and surviving, and therefore causing infection and hopefully killing the enemy in this sense. But this obviously has some cons in the thing, because obviously also the blade has a different balance, so for fencing it you use other kind of weapons. But these things were thrown. Yeah, the idea was to cause horrendous wounds of some sort, so that the wound was all kind of messed up and it could more easily infect. Especially at the long range, if you're attacking an enemy at a close range, you need a weapon who hopefully puts the enemy out of action immediately. Instead, while you're using darts like this, you don't care much about that, but about killing the enemy immediately, but rather wounding him in a way that will hopefully put him out of action on the longer time. And in the Scythians, in this sense, quite rarely got to hand-to-hand combat. This is another thing has to be borne in mind. We'll see it later, especially during the Achaemenid expedition into Scythia. So the Scythians, as we said before, were really prepared to any kind of tactical events, and their favorite tactics definitely relied on this hit and run and movements and harassing the enemy without coming even to a conclusive fight. They practiced scorched heads as well. They did scalp enemies as well. So even with a grammatical mistake, I brought something in that is interesting as well. This was another, taking the enemy's scalp was also here a matter of the symbol of the enemy's strength, especially the hair. The Scythians wore usually very long hair, and like in other civilizations, also in the Middle Ages, the hair were from this pagan past, even when everybody had got more or less Christianized, the symbol of beauty, as even in this almost eugenetical sense. I mean, the idea that the man was beautiful and strong was also a better warrior. So taking his scalp was essentially taking, or sometimes just beheading him, was taking really the core of the strength of that person. I don't remember what it was. That the Scythians practice a scorched earth policy against the enemy, so that also because they weren't sedentary, or at least they were only partly sedentarized, so it was easy for them to just shift everything, and they didn't even care about the enemy ravaging their land more than much, because they could simply shift somewhere else. So this is some of the advantages of the nomadic populations. Obviously the reality is a bit more complex, but it's still something that conferred the Scythians an edge over other people in relative terms. So it's very difficult to tell how the Scythian army was organized. First of all, because there was no Scythian army proper, in the sense that these were all, as we have seen, tribal contingents that kind of joined together, and there was probably a certain degree also of a large degree of autonomy in spite of the preeminence of certain tribes. So it was really a matter of political negotiations who would join and who would not. There is this idea that obviously most of the Scythian army, at least in early times, was made up of cavalry. Then eventually infantry kind of followed, an increase in numbers. And this was this idea that the Scythians, for being in a sense very egalitarian in mindset, being all tribes, they however had a kind of unique intent. They could have let's say they could join all together in certain conflicts, into attacking a certain area. We saw it before, thinking about how much it took to organize an expedition, how much prowess and commitment it took to organize an expedition to the Near East and to go fighting enemies, leaving your heartland thousands of kilometers behind. So the Scythians were in this sense very much organized from a logistical point of view. They could really leave off of just pillaging. This is also probably why they were also such harsh raiders, because it takes a lot just only to field an army of horsemen that consumes a freaking lot. So that's what they were doing. And they were highly mobile also as armies, so they could be quick and like to. It's possible technically to feed yourself, especially if you're not if you don't have more than some thousand troops, just by ravaging the country you're passing in. Given if that is not already ravaged, it could also happen, or there has not been a famine and harvest, a bad harvest or something like that. But I like very much this statement that the ancient historians made on the Scythians, because they back an opinion that I think I've always had about these populations, that the more their military quality, the higher their military quality was, and the more there was a perfect understanding of what the whole international situation was about at the time. So we don't have to think the ancient world or the medieval worlds as worlds were closed into themselves, like conceiving Scythia as something close or circumscribed, where the Scythians were thinking to be. First of all, the nomadic mindset is pretty much open by itself, but secondly, there was a lot of reconnaissance that necessarily was required to carry out this kind of international expeditions to go fight against some of the greatest powers of the ancient world, like the Assyrians or the Egyptians and so on. And the Scythians knew that from their nomadic population of the steppes. They knew what was happening all around. So just for stressing how the ancient world was not at all closed, was not primitive in the sense of communication, of intelligence, and all. Naturally, there was not, probably certain things were not even rationalized. I mean, the political news traveled fast through trade, through mostly, I believe, and it was kind of felt when an area went in political turmoil, was weak, and therefore there was it was the right moment, together with other contingent factors, for attacking in there and making this effect. So the Scythians had this kind of great organizational capabilities. Then there are bodies of infantry that start to appear. Also here, sling fire appears. However, the Scythian army maintains especially this extremely especially missile capacity of shooting projectiles at the enemy constantly. And the cavalry was extremely skilled. This went, especially heavy cavalry had an excellent training, but also the horse archers were capable of swarming into, to moving into swarms and to, to go back and forth and to harass the enemy continuously. It was a very high degree of collective training, because these bands were doing that literally for all their lives. Some of these people lived literally, they spent on horseback their life. So they were capable of doing things that today we can even only dream about, and to perform these highly quick and devastating assaults and retreating when the enemy was trying to pursue him and trying to lure him into an ambush and stuff like that. It was the typical steppe warfare. And this is very unnerving. I mean, especially staying there in a formation, being hit by arrows without the chance of hitting the enemy back, or at least not to counterattack, is something that is psychologically devastating. It really makes you feel really seriously bad. And ancient warfare was plain butchery. Let's be honest about it. it's impossible already to say how many people, how many warriors the Scythians could field. First of all, because it's largely influent, given in fact that Scythia wasn't mobilized as a whole, rarely, and it was a matter of who led what. There was no unitary organization. In spite of the cooperation that we have seen, it was still possible. And there is an anecdote, always from Herodotus, when the Scythian king Arianthus decided allegedly to establish how many subjects existed in Scythia. And he basically obliged every Scythian to, on pain of death, by the way, to bring one arrowhead to the master. And so, according to Herodotus, so many arrowheads were brought that the king decided to make a monument with this material. Talking about an enormous enormous quantity of one arrowhead for each Scythian. So this is obviously a legend and so on, but it tells us one thing. First of all, obviously the Scythians were many, and also because it was a highly militarized society. Every freeman was eligible for, it already did fight, essentially. Secondly, it tells us, however, that these Scythian overlords believed, they took as a matter of pride the idea of mobilizing this entire force theoretically, saying how much we are as a stock, even from a sheer demographical point of view, powerful, because also demographics at that point was a really a very important thing. The Scythians were seemingly extremely numerous, given also the environments where they lived. It's very interesting. Thucydides states that the Scythian army was at large was larger than 150,000 men. Because seemingly, allegedly, when the Scythians fought against the Thracians were 150,000, and Thucydides states that the Scythians were more. Naturally, these are exaggerations. No army in the ancient world ever reached anything like that, but it still can tell us about the size of the overall Scythian population and the potential of their military. So there is another chapter that is very interesting about this, that is the Persian invasion of Scythia. Recently I made a video specifically dedicated to the first Persian invasion of Greece that happened also under Darius, that led, in fact, had led at the end of the 6th century the campaign against the Scythians. This context is very interesting. Also here the main source is Herodotus, and we know actually very few of how it actually was, because as long as the Persians invaded Greece, the Greeks wrote about it and were more informed, etc. This the criticism also with Herodotus is that he seemingly made up a lot of things, and however I think it's possible. Definitely the Persians invaded Scythia. I don't think anything strange with that, even giving the details that Herodotus offers us in the description is perfectly plausible, but we know still a very few about it, and we can't fully assess the whole. So, as we were saying before, however, it's important to stress how the young Achaemenid Empire at this point had Scythian origins in turn, and the Medes that remembered also the harassment of the Scythians at this point decide to invade Scythia as to show essentially the greatness of their own empire. The Achaemenid Empire at this point was the most powerful empire in the world, and they wanted to prove they could defeat the Scythians that were so dreaded as warriors and to subjugate them. Naturally, this was meant mostly at the time for commercial reasons, like to open the markets of the area into the Black Sea, and having this obliging, probably this probably had to do also with the chance of obliging the Greeks also to grow dependent on the Achaemenid Empire, especially for grain imports, as from the Black Sea a lot of grain really came. So now the Achaemenids held basically everything. I mean, from Egypt to India. They could these were expeditions that always had this kind of grand strategy aims, and attacking the Scythians seemed, at least in perspective, pretty bad idea, but probably at the time, and we don't know enough about the campaign to say, how feasible that was, but it's still a very interesting chapter, and probably the Achaemenids had a certain, accounts to settle with the Scythians, but also they probably felt to be challenged by an equal, not in the proper sense, because obviously the Achaemenid already believed to be greater than the Scythians, but given their past memory, their tribal memory, they probably had to prove they were as strong as those Scythians that had remained there in the steppe while the Medes had gone for this. And part of the Scythians themselves, as they had gone for this Mesopotamian venture, this Iranian venture in creating a sedentary empire, so changing, really, actually inheriting the Assyrian Empire, and however changing radically their culture. So it was also a matter of pride in many ways, as most wars definitely, but here it was something probably more identitary that we can't fully grasp, but just speculate on. So as we were saying before, at the time of the Persian invasion that happened, I think, if I'm not wrong, in 512 BC, the Scythian raids into the Middle East had ceased from roughly 1 century. So there were still people who surely remembered about the stories of their grandfathers and stuff like that, and the same Scythians probably took great pride about the idea of having stormed these extremely rich areas of Armenia, of Syria and Palestine, and even Babylon, and this was a great pride for a people, in fact, that was nomadic, and so with great, let's say, lust, at least the accomplishment of the sedentary civilization as a sort of prize to take, so as an object of their rapacity, but at the same time that they admired it, so that they obviously felt also that their culture was very different, and they had been very proud about having gone in there, and so on. And evidently at this time it's possible that the Achaemenids invaded Scythia also for probably stemming further Scythian incursions, because that was still theoretically possible. They knew what the Scythians were capable of. They had already done it, they couldn't do it again. Now into the same lands the Achaemenids were now ruling. At this time, Darius the First was ruling. He had managed to create his mighty state. He had participated in a civil war, managed to create this huge power we all know about. And the idea in here was just to invade Scythia proper. A reconnaissance force was sent into the Balkans, because the Persians passed through to the Dardanelles, if I'm not wrong, and they built this also this I think it was a this reconnaissance force was sent by Ariar Ramnes, who was a satrap, so he's actually a provincial ruler. Similarly, 100 ships were involved. These numbers are high, but they could actually prove that before sending an expedition in there, the Persians wanted to be sure already some. First of all, a bridgehead could be established, but secondly, to see really how feasible it was. Also, because I don't think they knew excessively much of what the situation was in there. I mean, before you launch in such an expedition, you have to be a bit more sure of the situation. So this, by the way, revealed the Scythians how what that the intentions of Darius were pretty hostile, and so this first expedition had some success. So after this, according to Herodotus, the Persians levied something like 700,000 men, so something amazing. Others tell 800,000. Obviously, such numbers were not realistic, but it still tells us it was a pretty big expedition. And the number of ships employed for the greater expedition now was 600. So in here we can speculate probably were tens of thousands of troops, realistically. I mean, at the time was a huge army. Such an empire like the Achaemenid one could produce such armies, but you couldn't really see them around, and especially moving so far, like from Persia to Scythia. So this was probably some of the greatest armies of antiquity, indeed. There was this bridge of boats crossed over the Hellespont, and that was used from the Persians to pass from Asia into Europe. Actually, the first operations were led against the Thracian tribes that actually were pretty, they surrendered practically to the Persians at this point. And I mean, Thrace, now I don't want to overload with details, but it wasn't really a unite power. I mean, the Thracians were definitely deemed as a warlike and fierce and capable people, but evidently the Persians were had deployed an overwhelming force, and these were all scattered tribes that kind of obeyed to Darius. So Darius arrived up to the Danube, and he crossed it into Scythian territory. Initially Darius had planned to destroy the bridge behind him on the Danube, and adding ships along the marches on these shores to support the logistics that was probably now evidently the greatest problem, such a faraway land, by the way. There is an interesting thing here that I won't get into detail, but allegedly Darius, according to Herodotus, told to the rear guard that was left, I think, on the Danube, to basically count with a system how much time the bulk of the Persian army would stay away while venturing to Scythia, and if it had taken too long, basically to destroy to go away, actually to sail home, because this was the idea. Evidently also the Persians were aware that the Scythian territory was pretty dangerous. Also it was known as this desolated, I mean not really desolated, but this steppe environment is really a nightmare to get in, especially for such an army with a huge logistical needs, as there are no major centers. There is no sanitary civilization proper. There is best something semi-nomadic. So the Persians knew what we're going into, also in terms of scorched earth strategy that could be carried out against them and all. This is interesting because the Persians were aware of, generally speaking, of how that area worked, so they had probably also prepared their army in a fashion that could cope with those environmental problems. The Scythians at this time were obviously not taken by surprise, because such huge expeditions cannot be concealed. They already knew that, but the main problem at this point was that, just like, the problem was they feared the Persian army themselves. I mean, also in here, there were, many people think that horse, archer, combined tactics are kind of the ultimate tactics that defeats everyone. This is not really true. It still takes a freaking lot of different abilities to perform, to reach a victory like this, and it doesn't, the fact of having at this point there is not great asymmetry between the armies, really. I mean, war is always asymmetric, but this, it was mostly a logistical problem as a whole. Also, the Persian army was quite very tough nut to crack. We said it before. Also, harassing the such armies with arrows was not enough to eventually make them melt away. They still needed there was still the need of a heavy cavalry force to go and crash against it, and this meant that if these armies were spent in this way, it might as well as been possible the Scythians could have suffered such a defeat or enough losses for not being able, at least in a short time, to reacquire to counter the enemy invasion. So naturally, it's obvious that Persia would have not occupied Scythia as such. What they wanted was essentially to crush the enemy into battle, prove their superiority, obliging them to become tributaries, and that's it. There was no way to control Scythia, but this battle could be done. And the initial as we were saying, probably the Persians were attacking the Scythian territory in response of the invasions, the Scythian invasions of the previous centuries into Mesopotamia. And at this point, it was evident the Persians were determined to invade, and there was obviously a debate between the Scythian chieftains on what to do, and they decided essentially to avoid open confrontation and to start carrying out a scorched earth strategy. So they started to withdraw, filling up the wells and springs and burning all the grass along the way. This is very interesting because definitely they could move, so they could find other pastures to go in. They didn't need developed agricultural systems that in this sense were rooted like in the sanitary world around certain centers and on. They could hopefully get somewhere else that probably was not better than where they dwelled, because if they had been dwelling in those places that were abandoning, presumably there were better places than others. But this would basically ensure that the Persians couldn't basically obtain anything from those lands. So obviously, there was always something to obtain. Now the Persians also had an amazing logistics, but it was a pretty serious thing to do and to advance in such a devastated territory with such a big army like the Persian one. So you have to imagine the Scythians here moving like the whole community, so women, children, old people, together with the young warriors, and they were a society that was said before was used to these kind of movements and was perfectly organized to respond to carry it out quickly. So they decide that, however, to harass the Persians, or at least to send to divide their forces, to split their forces into two. And also to meet actually the invaders, because you could always refuse the battle, but still keeping them in agitation and increasing the attrition, making them lose resources along the way. This would also create another problem, because you might have outflanked the army in some way, trying to cut their logistical routes, supplies, and so on. The idea was also to gain time to allow all the population to move. So to slow down the Persian advance with this goal, and obviously trying to reduce also these the amount of lands had to be abandoned. So naturally the Scythians were hoping to wear the enemy out in this process. Naturally they had this edge because Herodotus tells us that the Persian army was, as usual, mostly an infantry force. They definitely had cavalry, also probably other Scythian cavalry even with them. But definitely the Scythians were all mounted at this point, and they could they had a greater strategical mobility. Also, the weapons of these two armies weren't excessively different in practice. I didn't say the Scythians also had axes and all. This is something you find also in the Persian army. The Persians had also a lot of archers. Definitely the Scythians had the best archers, but they weren't, after all, that hugely different. They were still coming also here from the same traditions, in part. Probably what frightened the Persians, the Scythians the most were these heavier Persian infantry that was armored enough to resist, protected enough to resist to the hail of arrows. So the Persians began their march eastward, northeastwards into the Scythian heartland, and this advance was very, very slow. We don't actually know what kind of route the Persians took. Most of these informations are pretty unreliable. Herodotus claims that the Persians covered like 5,000 kilometers in 2 months. That is completely absurd and impossible. Even if they had been all mounted, it would have been an amazing feat, and it's completely impossible. Nor the Persians needed to go where, actually, because 5,000 kilometers are actually a lot. You're gonna arrive to I can say to the Arctic pole, of course, but to the Arctic Circle. But I mean, even Russia, as vast as it is, it's not so huge. And where did the Persians have to go, wandering in the unknown for thousands of kilometers? Is absolutely false. Probably the Persians remained actually along the coast and were heading towards, in my opinion, they were relatively close to the coast, where they could be also backed by a fleet, better supplies, and heading towards Crimea, probably, and the center, and from there maybe trying to, through the rivers, to sail up, sail up towards the north, but not in such depth. And by the way, consider also in here the same rivers in crossing longitudinally that exists in there. Think about the Dniester, the southern Bug, the Ingolets, the Dnieper, the Don. So these are huge. They're very big natural obstacles. So there are countless smaller rivers, marshes everywhere, and so this was actually a nightmare in many ways, and at this point the Scythians were constantly harassing the Persian supply lines, and probably the Persians were short of food, water, and forage. So these are all problems that are crucial to any army, and the Scythians were evidently counting on weakening the enemy at that point. The main problem here, in fact, is that the Scythians were avoiding contact, and this the more it's a kind of a mathematical approach. The more the Persian army went in depth to the enemy territory, the more it grew weaker. On the contrary, the Scythians that had all their resources still there, more or less, yeah, they had abandoned some territories, but they were able to still to have the majority of their forces intact, were now growing stronger. Also because surely there were many Scythians who had would have preferred maybe to accept an Achaemenid rule and remain into this decentralized context and kind of living with it, knowing that after all it wasn't so bad. But the majority of the Scythians had not wanted this, and now the more the Achaemenids grew, the weaker the Achaemenids grew, the more chieftains would join into putting pressure on the Achaemenid army. So it was a very serious situation for the Persians. At a certain point, in fact, Darius, who was leading the expedition, by the way, stopped, built a large fortified camp somewhere north of the coast of the Sea of Azov, perhaps close to the modern town of Berdyansk. So at this point we don't really know what he was doing in there. Naturally there was a lot of negotiation involved at all time. This might have been simply an headquarter, like a logistical center that previously could have not been built, as probably also the Persians had thought subjugating the Thracians and other populations along the way would have been more useful, and maybe they wanted to build an headquarter close to the Scythian territory to eventually operate from there. At the same time, obviously, this entails you need a big fortified center for making arrive the supplies through the Black Sea, from Asia, and we don't really know what it was doing at this point, what the point really was. But he however went on pursuing the Scythians, so kind of the principle is pretty evident. He just wanted to raid in their territory, obliging them to come to battle and hoping in the decisive victory and the subjugation of Scythia. So at this point there is an anecdote, as seemingly Darius sent a messenger to the Scythian king Thyrsus. And these negotiations brought to a kind of because the Scythians at this point were harassing the Persians, but they had not properly waged war on them in large scale. Obviously they had defended themselves, but they weren't so fully probably even acquainted with the Persians and their intentions. So Darius asked I'm quoting, strange man, to the Scythian king, why do you continually run away when given the choice? If you think yourself strong enough to contend with me, then stop roaming and turn and fight. If you confess yourself to be weaker than I, you will have to stop anyway and open negotiations with your ruler, bringing him earth and water as symbols of submission. So allegedly, Thyrsus replied, I have never run away for fear of any man. I'm wondering, as I always wonder in time of peace. This is beautiful. You ask why I did not fight you at once. May I remind you that we have neither cities nor cultivated land of our own. Since we are not afraid of our territory being ruined and plundered, we had no reason to fight you outright. And not will we, until we see fit. Instead of earth and water, I will send you other gifts of the kind you deserve, and you will pay me dearly for calling yourself my ruler. So this is beautiful, because it basically evidences in a nutshell what the problem was. Now, Darius was naturally asking to say, do you think I'm better? You're better than me? Those things. And eventually there was this kind of implicit recognition from the Persian side of the Scythian might that, in this sense, Darius was ironizing on, because he said, why don't you Well, you think you're better than me? Why don't you meet and fight? I'm giving you the chance to do it. And the guy answers something very interesting. Says, we don't care. We fight because we move always in war, even in peacetime, as nomads essentially. And this is a bit of a... he was a bit triggered in this sense, because he was evidently not moving because it was like in time of peace. They were moving because the Persians were arriving. But he told him basically, haven't you seen we don't have, what are you doing here? Haven't you seen we don't have cities in here? We don't have cultivated land of our own. What are you doing in here? You're gonna get ruined. And how do you dare to consider yourself my ruler? This is important because it's basically what the whole thing was about. The area was extremely difficult to control, and it was surely not a very easy ground to invade. So, bit of a problem in here. At this point, Darius was the Persian, excuse me, the Scythians. Sorry, I got numb a bit. The Scythians basically, at this point, war was practically declared. So they begin to harass the Persians, actually, and they hit on the Persian foraging parties that were definitely the ones that sustained the army. So they were easier to attack as they were dispersed and with a few guard, probably, and the and Scythian horsemen here gave the best, essentially, of their also because obviously they were much better skirmishers, and as these were, in all war, it's mostly about skirmishes than open battles. So in here the Scythians were masters, and the Persians probably suffered heavy casualties. Even the same Persian cavalry was repelled by the Scythians. So at this point, the Scythian king Edenthersus had committed the bulk of his personal forces, and he sent other troops to cut off the Persian retreat by destroying the boat bridge the Persians had built on the Danube. This was a very clever thing to do because it posed a great problem, and and at this point the Greeks, by the way, were joining the Scythians. I mean, the Greeks that were vassals of the Scythians in the Crimea region, also in the rest of the Ukraine. And however, this attempt seemingly failed. So it's fascinating also to see how the Scythians basically waited for having a more direct confrontation with the Persians to commit their whole forces. Probably they fear the Persians at the point of saying, okay, let's first see what it happens, and only eventually let's strike. In the meanwhile, Edenthersus began to send the gifts he had promised to Darius, which were oddly a mouse, a frog, and a bird. Now Darius interpreted these gifts as essentially, respectively, a symbol of the earth, as the mice ate grain, the frogs as a symbol of water, and the birds as a symbol of horses because they're free. So he interpreted it as if, the Scythians are basically asking us for submission, while a Persian courtier interpreted the message in a different way, and Herodotus states, that this explanation was essentially, if you don't fly away like birds, nor hide in the earth like mice, or leap into a lake like frogs, then you will basically die in here. You will never see your home again, and you'll die under the Scythian arrows. So this was very frightening thought. It was perfectly realistical eventuality. And in fact, events would prove this right. So the Scythian and Persian armies were facing constantly at the time, and the Persians decided to set out for a pitched battle. Doesn't matter how tired they were, they still thought they could beat the Scythians in battle. So while the two armies were facing, there is this episode that happens, sometimes also before the battles, that were all these symbolisms attached of certain animals passing by. It happens in many other accounts of the ancient world. Seemingly, a frightened hare, began to run into between the two armies, where they were skirmishing, and the Scythians seemingly stopped harassing the Persians and went chasing the hare. So the meaning of this was essentially the Scythians held the Persians in no contempt, so that if they prefer to follow a hare than dealing with us, that means that they actually they don't fear us, and there is not much could do. So Darius at this point, so this is all lost in kind of the mists of these stories, and that doesn't have to be taken all literally, of course. However, at this point, Darius probably retreats. And we can imagine, in strictly historical terms, I mean, probably the Scythians kept essentially refusing the fight. Even this, continuous confrontation that came to no end seems to suggest the Scythians objectively had no reason to risk everything into a bigger battle. And so Darius retreats. The invasion seemingly failed in some ways, and during his retreat, the Scythians tried also to there was also a pretty desperate run at this point, leaving the wounded and the other people and things that were considered unable to travel fast behind. At this point, probably the Scythians were keeping pressing the Persians during the retreat. They also tried perhaps to cut off their retreat as well, so to take the whole army, the whole Persian army, and circle in it, but it failed. It's interesting that the Scythians at this point recurred once again to their Greek subjects to say, okay, send those to send them build destroying especially the boat's bridge that was so crucial for the survival of the Persian army. And there was some attack seemingly at the Persian camp in the night, but with obscurity once again of all the mass, and the boat the bridge of boats was still intact. So the Persians made it to retreat. So this is how the Scythian invasion, the Persian invasion of Scythia happened in a nutshell. And this was evidently a Persian defeat. I mean, no objectives seemingly were accomplished, at least from what we know. And the Greeks and the Romans stressed how the Scythians in this sense had won their degree of invincibility, given the Achaemenid army was the most powerful at the time, and how they had managed to push away the invaders out of their land. Kind of very interesting. That definitely it's a lesson, a strategical lesson that obviously is based on the strategy here was pretty simple. strategies are usually not excessively complicated, and this war was won by the Scythians thanks to the organization of their society, this scorched land strategy, and presumably a better organized, better disciplined Persian army could basically do nothing but go far at the point of overstretching their supply lines and being obliged to come back, being constantly harassed by the Scythian pressure. And it's obvious that when the Persians were retreating, initially the Scythians were kind of prudent. They didn't provoke the Persians, not even if they had invaded their territory. When they saw they were losing steam and now also they began to retreat, they instead increased the pressure, so that they almost wore out the entire Persian army, and this was a very good reason not to try it anymore, and try to keep things essentially a good lesson taught to the Persians not to try it anymore. and definitely it's this is a kind of overlooked expedition that is very important, because in its simplicity it's very didactic, let's say, very useful to understand, also logistics and all in very simple terms. About Scythian tactics, we have a very few to know. We know the Scythians entered in contact with several peoples, but only a few wrote about them. We found Scythian artifacts as far as Poland, at Witaszkowo, I think it's called, and we find Scythian also in the Arctic Pole, into Mongolia. These were probably traded items, so not necessarily that the Scythians arrived up to there. But in case of Poland, it's interesting because we find the grave of a leader who was probably killed around the area, and this tells us that the Scythians were pushing also in there. In fact, in later times, the Scythians seem to have pushed westwards, and this is something we know also from the Roman ethnography, when talking about the Germans, that in the east were seemingly pressed and in part subjugated by the Scythians themselves. But as we were saying before, eventually it was mostly the Sarmatians that were pushing from the east and brought to this in part. I think it was a natural tendency to push westwards. This is all what the populations of the steppes did eventually into Europe. So there was an evident convenience in this, and this pushed, by the way, for the sedentarization of the Scythians, because not just the peoples are more sedentary, but also the environment forces you to be. The steppes end at a certain point. The forests begin, so that you can't just rely on cavalry, etc. And that's why probably also infantry emerged and was so frequent, especially in later Scythian armies. In this expansion towards west was also one towards southwest of the Scythians against the Thracians, especially after Darius had driven was driven back with shame by the Scythians. These began to kind of fill that gap, also trying to subjugate the Thracians that had fallen so relatively easily to the Persians. So they kept doing this throughout the 5th and 4th century, and that was the main direction of expansion at the time. And that's where the Scythians entered in contact also with Macedon, and were defeated by the army of no less than Philip II of Macedon, proving, by the way, how efficient the Macedonian army at that point was getting. The Scythians probably had craved for especially the northern Thracian lands for a long time, and sometimes it was not even necessary to use warfare in order to expand in the area, because eventually the Scythians were more powerful than the Thracians. The Thracians were kind of enclosed by... They had no much room to go, because in the east they had the sea, on the west they had mountains and other populations, like in the Getae or Getae. In the south now there was Macedon, the Greeks, so the Scythians began to impose their own lordship over these populations until in 339 BC the Scythian army and 90 years old king was killed, and his army defeated by the Macedonians. This really didn't mark really the end of the Scythian power. I mean, here the Scythians were essentially on the offensive still, so that's not really the point. However, 9 years later, a general Alexander the Great invaded Scythia with 30,000 men. The main objective here was conquering the city of Olbia. It was a Scytho-Hellenic center located into the northwestern shores of the Black Sea. And actually the Macedonians here were defeated, and allegedly the bones of the Macedonians were scattered all over the steppes around Olbia. And although, given this warfare that happened, we have no information about the tactics that were used. This is pretty sad, because also on the early Macedonian army we don't really know excessively much, and it would have been useful to know also for the Scythians. The only battle that instead is documented enough to tell us how the Scythians fought was the Battle of the River Thais, fought roughly between the either in 310 or 309 BC. So basically this was fought into by Scythia in the conflict that broke out between the heirs of the Bosphorian king Perisades. You know, there was a Bosphorian kingdom in Crimea. Was very powerful, based also on these Greek city-states. It was a very wealthy area also for trade, and the crossroad here of the steppes. I mean, those were areas that had a pretty good location for trade, as all areas of frontier between certain lands. So here Now I don't remember. I'm very tired, by the way. Today I didn't sleep enough, and it's probably evident the way I sound. However, there was essentially this battle between the Scythians and the Tataians, that basically were these people that once had been vassal of the Bosphorian kingdom, that now took this dynastic struggle to exploit this dynastic struggle to win its autonomy, to free themselves. And the Tatans and their king Ariphanes sided with Eumenes, that was one of the sons of the Bosphorian king, and this really brought up a huge army of 22,000 horse and 20,000 foot to resist instead the forces of Satyrus, who was instead the one who had managed to seize the son of the Bosphorian king, who had managed to seize control of the kingdom. That instead had Scythian allies with him en masse. So these numbers are interesting. Also, Satyrus' army was pretty large. Satyrus had a 34,000 men. Eumenes and the Tataians 42,000. It was, and the Scythians joined with Satyrus in a large force. There were also Greeks and Thracians into the Satyrus army. They were deployed, and yeah, we'll see then how they were deployed. So while Satyrus was pursuing his Eumenes and the Tatian army, he arrived at the river Theiss and found the enemy waiting for battle just across it. So he did something very bold. He crosses the Tatis River and he builds a camp in the front. So he sets for battle. Now we know very few about the actual strengths and how the deployment occurred. The formation really was. We know this time the Scythians, by the way, were also bringing a lot of wagons with them for logistical purposes. This is also another character of nomadic armies. They had to have these very huge, big amount of wagons that can be used in the open as fortresses sometimes. So the battle began essentially. Satyrus deployed the Greek mercenaries, and together with Thracian peltasts, the Greek mercenaries were probably hoplites on the right flank. And another detachment of cavalry was and infantry was held on the left wing. And at the center, instead, Satyrus deployed his select shock troops and the bulk of the Scythian horse, including the heavily armored Scythian elite. We know much less about the Tatian's army. Diodorus doesn't tell us much about this. We know that Eumenes was on the left flank and Aripharnes in the center. Eumenes led cavalry that was to engage the Greek and the Thracian mercenaries on Satyrus' right wing. And Aripharnes instead was in the center with the bulk of his cavalry and with heavy units. Probably there were lots of archers from both sides, and they kind of they stuck to that as that was the standard, as we said before. Probably the Scythians had more archers, but this is just speculation. And just think, the Bosphorian area was famous for its armor as well, because of this, especially to counter the Scythian arrows that existed in there. There was a lot of development in metallurgy in the area. So we think of these armies to be first of all, pretty large. I don't know if the numbers are reliable or realistic, but definitely the whole area was very developed and could field such armies theoretically. Probably there were many less troops than that, but they were pretty good troops as well, probably, and they had also pretty high military average, probably given this Bosphorian frontier was pretty tormented in many ways. So as soon as the battle began, it was a very dynamic encounter, actually, from a tactical point of view, as Eumenes on the left flank of the Tatian army basically managed to break, seemingly, or at least to make waver, the Greeks and the Thracians on the Scythian, right flank, while in the center the Bosphorian king, so Satyrus from the other side, led his Scythian horse forward, and he struck into Aripharnes' center, and seemingly the engagement was pretty short, and the Tan center was routed. So at this point, we don't know much about what is happening on the Scythian left flank, or respectively the Tatian right flank. But the masterpiece of this battle is essentially the Scythians regrouping in the midst of battle, in the center after having charged and broken the enemy center, and to wheel right and back to charge into the rear of Humana's force, so wiping out his advantage on the right flank and basically routing not just his forces but the whole Tathan troops. So this battle is amazing because it's basically, first of all, it's possibly the battle in all the ancient world that's so the greatest use of cavalry, at least if we stay to the numbers that are given by Diodorus. This was an impressive force, really a huge one. And what is more amazing is controlling this man on the battlefield, and what the Scythians managed to do in the center. That is, as we've said, you break an army, you break the center, charging essentially against other cavalry, so already proving, and heavy cavalry by the way, so already proving your own superiority over it. And it's gonna, and it was a seemingly short engagement, so probably the impetus of the Scythians brought to this victory, let's say, and but also order, naturally, because that was the first thing, but that tells you how strong these charges could also be. Now, in the midst of the battle, there is a pretty messy situation. These guys found the strengths and the ability to redraw, to lead a charge into the enemy rear. It can give you, attacking on the enemy rear can be done also en masse, just to, you know, to shatter the enemy at the point of breaking. This is something usually when you're attacked from the rear, you're done for. So we don't really know, but it's still remarkable that these guys, and in such big numbers, were managed to reorganize and to launch a second charge. There were no many other cavalries in the ancient world could perform such a maneuver, and with such large numbers. So this is really the Battle of River Tatis is really probably an underrated battle. Obviously we know there's few, so it's unfortunate, but it's still important because it's the only battle into which we see actually what the Scythians fought like in a formation. And we're gonna essentially have to stick to this because we don't have any other evidence of other tactics performed, other deployments, other formations. It's a pity. By the way, this shows also the ability of the Scythians to kind of integrate other elements in the formation, to cooperate with them in synergy, and this confirms, let's say, the suggested quality of the Scythian cavalry, also especially maneuvering, which is ultimately what really makes the difference on the field. And at least on average, it's all about, mostly about that. So, sorry, today I was a bit low tone, but I'm dead tired and a bit annoyed by other things I want to bother you with. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. I'm gonna quit here. I could make a broader comment on the Scythians, but I think I said most everything I wanted to say. There is no need for that. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.